Hello, my name is Daniel Shatzkin and I am the editor-in-chief of the LD Brief produced by Champion Briefs. Our latest edition has really good evidence and excellent TAs. I hope you check it out. Today I'm here to discuss our current topic: wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations. First, let's start with some definitions on the topic. I start with defining wealthy nations, and the way that we can define wealthy nations are first by analyzing its GDP, or gross domestic product, which is an aggregate measure of production equal to the sum of the gross values added of all residents and institutional units engaged in production, plus any taxes and minus any subsidies on products not included in the value of their outputs. Basically, it's how much a country produces within its own borders. Next is the gross national income, which is the total domestic and foreign output claimed by residents of the country, consisting of gross domestic product plus factor incomes earned by foreign residents minus income earned in domestic economy by non-residents. So basically, it's all the amount of the GDP fixed for the amount of money earned only by residents of the country and citizens of the country that may not be living within its own borders. So that's really trying to show how much a country produces itself, how much its own citizens produce, not necessarily foreign citizens producing in its own country. And there's some interesting distinctions that will occur there, because say countries like Qatar and things like that in the Middle East, where they bring in a lot of foreign workers, actually have a significantly lower GNI than they do GDP. And that's because a lot of production that does occur within the country occurs from foreign companies and foreign workers, not based on their own industries. So there are little shifts and things like that. The next way that you can define wealthy nations is looking through international organizations and groups and how they define wealthy nations. For example, there's the group of 8 nations, and those consist of France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, Japan, the United States, Canada, and Russia. There's also the group of 20 nations, which are Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, and the European Union. These types of groups are really, really good ways to define it, because it limits out exactly what countries are wealthy nations, whereas if you just define it based on GDP or GNI standards, they're kind of arbitrary. So these are countries that are basically internationally recognized as developed nations, and that kind of makes a distinction versus just wealthy, and it's how we actually can create some sort of topical distinction that is done at least by some international standard. It is not arbitrarily created just by you within the debate round. Next, we look towards the word obligation and how we define obligation, and that's just something by which a person is bound or obliged to do certain things, and which arises out of a sense of duty or results from customs or law. So basically, it's just saying that we have a duty to provide development assistance if you're a wealthy wealthy nations have a duty to provide development assistance. Where that duty comes from should come from some standard, whether it's a moral obligation that you argue, maybe there's a legal obligation, whatever the obligation that you're saying exists to provide development assistance comes from this obligation. So, next is then how we would define development assistance. Development assistance can be broken down into 2 categories, and this is important to note, and that's that there's official development assistance, which is money that's given from one state to another state, and then there's private development assistance, which is assistance that comes from private organizations. Now, states do fund NGOs, which are non-governmental organizations that provide development assistance, but that money comes from the state to the NGO, then to the next country. That's not a country providing development assistance to another nation. That's just a country providing assistance to an NGO, who then goes out and provides development assistance. So how you allow for development assistance to be defined, and the functionality of development assistance, and where it comes from to the other nation, can affect how the arguments are going to be used in the round, because you can easily argue things like NGO counterplans and private development assistance counterplans on the negative as being a better alternative to state-funded development assistance. And in that case, then the states aren't giving money directly to the other countries, so it may not be topical. So there are a lot of ways that you can play with the definition of development assistance. The next way you have to look at development assistance is, what is development assistance? Most international organizations define development assistance in a way that provides some form of economic, environmental, social, political, or political development within countries that are in the developing world. Next, then, we'd have to look at the phrase nations, right? Nations can mean a wide variety of things, and I think it's very important to note that most countries that have indigenous populations within them view those indigenous populations as a nation of people, or a sovereign entity in some aspect. So this opens the door for discussions about indigenous populations and native peoples around the world and the lands that they live on, and the development issues that exist within those lands. For example, native populations in the United States face significant issues with transportation infrastructure, power grid issues, environmental issues. So there are all sorts of issues that exist on Native American lands in our own country here in America that could then be discussed. And, I think a very interesting conversation and debate would be if a foreign country provided development assistance to Native American populations within our own borders, and what that message would send around the world and to probably the American people as a whole. So there are a lot of really interesting ways that you can get into these conversations with on Native American populations, and a lot of interesting arguments that opens up. Next, I'd like to move on to some different framework questions that can exist. And the framework questions on this topic are very, very interesting, because we can start with just obligation-based frameworks. And where do obligations of nations arise? Do nations have obligations to foreign nations? Do nations only have obligations to their own citizens? How does development assistance meet these obligations? Or maybe they don't meet these obligations. For example, if development assistance, or if nations have other obligations to foreign countries, does providing development assistance meet that obligation? Or are there only security maybe obligations that we have to other nations, and that we only have to provide security for other nations and keep a system of security? Maybe we need to talk about how there are obligations only to citizens of one's own country. And the AF and NEG both have equal ground on this area, because there are areas of development assistance that definitely come back and benefit the country providing that assistance. It opens up economic marketplaces. It probably even increases some concepts of safety if you want to talk about terrorism and issues of that. But there are authors out there that say that equally that development assistance may actually increase terrorist sentiments and things like that. There are also people that say that development assistance can cause environmental harms and environmental damages. So there are a lot of different ways that you can look towards the obligation-based frameworks, and whether that obligation is towards an individual or the obligation is towards another country. There are a lot of different approaches based on the obligation framework, and I think the obligation framework is one that can be used in almost any type of setting. Whether you want to have a very traditional case or a more progressive case, starting based on an obligation framework is not a bad starting point, because you can incorporate a lot of different theories and concepts into that obligation and what it means to meet the obligations that different states have. Next would be just looking towards maybe a little bit more progressive style frameworks, which lead you towards things like virtue ethics, and even maybe some sort of frameworks that deal with supporting oppressed peoples and things like that. All of these frameworks can fit under this topic because of just how broad this whole topic area is. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can address the framework debate on this topic. And ultimately, the framework question is going to be one of the region that you debate in and the type of judges that you're going to see. Are they going to want more traditional based frameworks like the ones in obligation, or are they going to be willing to listen to various other types of frameworks that may or may not be, based on that obligation, but rather are looking towards the intents of what we're doing? Does the plan support concepts of maybe neoliberalism, And maybe the negative framework is one that is to create the best pedagogy in the round. And the way that we create the best pedagogies are to, reject neoliberalism. So there's a lot of different ways that we can frame the round under this topic. And ultimately, it's just going to be about what framing is best within your region. I think starting on the obligation framing and then moving towards more progressive frameworks would probably is the best way to start on researching this topic, because a lot of the stuff that you would use to support the obligation-based frameworks is evidence that you'd use to support more specific frameworks as well. So it all just depends on what you want to do and what your style is, because this topic is just so open to basically anything. There are also a lot of really interesting positions that you can run on this topic. There are basic development assistance, good and bad arguments that would function under, development assistance increases environmental damage, decreases environmental damage. There are questions as to whether developmental assistance can, help economies. Developmental assistance could increase or decrease anti-Western sentiment, which could increase or decrease terrorism. So many different ways that development assistance could be just good or bad for a population of a country. There's also a lot of arguments about democracy promotion. A lot of those developed nations that were listed out are democracies, and inherently within development assistance, a lot of times is democracy promotion and arguments based on that. Democracy promotion can link you into all sorts of different arguments, from leadership to hegemony to just democracy being good things. Maybe democracy is a bad thing. Maybe democracy promotion is a bad thing. So those types of arguments are really, really good arguments to base the frameworks on, and you can move on there. There are native assistance acts, like I talked about before, and then there are also a lot of arguments against those types of affirmatives that say that those types of assistance are really just a patchwork. You can argue give back the land K. You can also argue the DDEV K, de-development K. I think the de-development K is an interesting one that's probably going to be run a lot on this topic, just because of the nature of what this topic is. Talking about development, obviously the neg can argue that development is bad, and the real answer is we need to de-develop, which would be a very interesting debate to be had, because they're polar opposites on this topic. One argues for more development, the other argues for de-development. So there's very, very good link ground for that type of argumentation. I think, as I mentioned before, the neoliberalism and colonialism arguments, a lot of the intent stuff, if you use an intentionality-based frameworks, the intent behind development assistance is to ultimately increase influence in another country, potentially. And the rhetoric that's used behind development assistance is one of control in a lot of ways. So the arguments for neoliberalism and colonialism are very, very strong. There's also things like the Empire K, with authors like Hart and Negri, who talk about extending the empirical influence of countries and things like that, and it's new forms of an empire to just have countries that follow along with you. So there are a lot of different things there. I think there's some substantial ground for discourse-based argumentation on the topic for the negative, and the discourse that surrounds development assistance and development in general, about developed and non-developed countries. The third world is a phrase that's generally frowned upon in most academic circles, that though some people still use. So I'd be very careful with the words that you use and how you frame development assistance, because there's a lot of discourse-based arguments that can be used when it comes to development assistance. And then there's some really good policy-style argumentation that can be used. There's some very interesting ways that you can run some counterplans on this topic. I think one argument would be a conditions-based counterplan, where you can put conditions on aid, because right now the topic just says to provide aid, and how you define provide. If provide just means to give, right? Is there a condition on giving that? It all depends on how you want to define it. I don't know specifically, each scenario where we can put a condition on aid, but there are definitely scenarios that we put conditions on aid all the time. For example, we used to, there is a thing called the global gag rule, where we put a condition on medical aid to foreign country. The United States did that. And the foreign aid that we gave in medical aid couldn't be used for abortions in foreign countries. And that's a form of conditional aid, right? You can use this money for medical assistance if and only if it goes towards one form of medical assistance and not another form. So there are a lot of different forms of conditional aid that exist out there that can be a very, very good argument. There's also the NGO's counterplan. Remember before I talked about private development assistance versus official development assistance. And if you define that development assistance very narrowly as the negative, it opens the ground for you to argue that private development assistance is the best way to go about the plan. So ultimately, there are a lot of different ways that can be used to argue about this topic on a policy style. I think different forms of disadvantages would be really, really helpful on this topic. Like a politics disadvantage, for example, would be an excellent argument on this topic. You can easily find links to this argument because President Trump has repeatedly argued against providing foreign aid and cutting the foreign aid budget. So in doing so and reversing that policy by saying that we have an obligation to provide foreign aid, what does that do to U.S. foreign policy? What does that do towards U.S. domestic policy? What does that do towards midterm elections and things like that? So there are a lot of different scenarios that you can get into when it comes to a politics DA. You know, the budget bill that's coming up and budget reconciliation process, what is saying that, you know, the United States has an obligation to foreign aid do? Because the topic is broad and talks about wealthy nations, I think it would be very interesting for a negative position to talk about foreign aid in terms of other countries in a disad. You know, a politics DA that deals with like Russian politics and foreign aid would be interesting. Or even you can have like trade-off arguments and clashes with foreign aid. You know, if two different countries that are competing, if the U.S. and Russia both compete for the influence within that country, what happens? Do we get proxy wars and things like that? So there are a lot of different disadvantages that can be done with trade-offs and things like that. You can run a spending disadvantage or a fiscal discipline disadvantage or even business confidence DAs. Because it's spending money and it's government spending money, and government spending money always have different various effects. And you know, these arguments are really good in areas that accept policy style argumentation that are cool with, you know, scenarios going to nuclear war and extinction and stuff like that. These are very good arguments. I also think there's a lot of room in the round for a lot of critical discourse in the debate, whether you want to go from more traditional case like, you know, biopower or borders types argument that talks about, you know, how we control people using concepts of borders, and, you know, borders are how we create distinctions of an other that may not exactly exist. For example, between, you know, different countries, that you cross one border and then you're in a developed nation, and, you know, you can go 45 feet over a border and you're suddenly not in a developed nation. And the arbitrary distinction of 45 feet in a border is what creates that, you know, dividing line between you know, developed and undeveloped, and the implications from those things. There are a lot of discussions about feminist theory and international relations that could be very interestingly applied to this topic. So there are a lot of different ways that you can look towards this topic. You can look towards it as maybe how it deals with Islamophobia and issues with that, and foreign aid to you know, predominantly Islamic nations, and what that does to society by, you know, maybe shifting changes in perceptions in the Islamic world to not associating, you know, everything with terrorism in the Islamic world, and the benefits that can come from doing that, and vice versa. Maybe by doing that, we increase the likelihood of Islamophobia because we increase the likelihood of terrorist attacks. You know, there are a lot of different ways that you can argue those types of things. Even traditional critique grounds, such as, you know, a Nietzsche critique and things like that, arguing about the security implications and what that means and what the drive for security means. There are so many different critical routes that you can go on this topic because of the broad nature of this topic. Really is up to you about the route that you want to take. I think that a good starting point is to look at some of the research that's already been done on this topic. Our brief has a lot of the arguments that I just briefly mentioned before throughout it. And then there are many other ways that you can go about researching for this topic and looking through it. But I believe that starting with our Champion Briefs edition for this topic is a great way to start. It's good progressive evidence. We also have a lot of the obligation-based evidence that I discussed in this TA, and I hope you really check it out. And good luck with this topic. And thank you for listening.